You already know the line. The Dark Ages weren't actually dark. The monasteries kept the lights on. The barbarians made beautiful things. Islamic scholars saved Greek philosophy while Europe forgot it. Charlemagne built an empire. The Lindisfarne Gospels exist. The Sutton Hoo treasure exists. Historians have been saying this for decades, and they are right to say it. The Renaissance invented the myth of the barbaric void, and the myth deserved to be killed. By 600 CE, Rome had gone from 1 million people to somewhere around 20,000. Cities across Britain, Gaul, and North Africa that had run fresh water to every street corner were quiet. Fields that Roman farmers had worked for generations were growing back into forest across the western provinces. Children were shorter than their great-grandparents had been. The long-distance ships had stopped coming. Something happened to the people, not to the art, not to the theology, not to the metalwork of kings, but to the people. And that is what this video is about. Rome at its height was not an idea or an empire in the abstract. It was a system, a physical, logistical system that kept millions of people alive who could not have fed themselves from local land alone. When that system worked, it was the most sophisticated network of human organization the ancient world had ever produced. When it stopped working, people died. Grain ships crossed the Mediterranean every season by the hundreds. In Egypt alone, supplied roughly a third of Rome's annual grain needs. North Africa supplied much of the rest. Without those ships, the city of Rome, which held somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people at its peak, could not eat. The city's survival was a maritime problem solved every year by fleets of merchant vessels running on seasonal schedules. Fresh water came in on stone. 11 aqueducts fed the city. Yes, and at their peak, they delivered something close to 1,000 liters of fresh water per person per day, more than double what the average American uses today. That water fed hundreds of public fountains, the great bath complexes, the private homes of the wealthy, and the workshops and bakeries of the poor. Cities across the empire replicated the model. A provincial town in Gaul or Hispania or North Africa expected clean water as a basic feature of urban life. See, olive oil from Hispania arrived in Rome in such quantities that the broken amphorae used to transport it formed a hill on the banks of the Tiber still visible today. Monte Testaccio, 50 meters high, built almost entirely from discarded shipping containers. Fish sauce, made in factories on the Lusitanian coast, was consumed by soldiers on Hadrian's Wall. Glass blowers in Syria supplied drinking vessels to households across the western provinces, where a middling Roman family in 200 CE used goods from a dozen different corners of the empire as a matter of course. The road network covered over 400,000 kilometers. It was not built for scenery. Goods moved on it, armies moved on it, and, critically, information moved on it. The empire ran on written Latin. Contracts, tax records, legal proceedings, military orders, imperial decrees, all of it was paper and ink crossing enormous distances at speeds that post-Roman Europe would not match for centuries. The ability to write and read was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. A Roman legionary ate roughly 3,000 calories a day, received a salary in coin, and expected a land grant on discharge. A craftsman in a provincial city earned wages, paid rent, bought food at a market, and could in principle take a dispute to a court. These were not the conditions of flourishing in any modern sense. Life expectancy at birth was low, infant mortality was brutal, and slavery underpinned the entire system. Perhaps 10 to 15% of the population in Italy was enslaved. But within those constraints, ordinary life had a predictability and a material scale that most people in post-Roman Western Europe would not see again for 500 years. The slave economy is not a footnote. Rome's material comfort, its cities, as its baths, its roads, its food supply rested on coerced labor that was total, routine, and legal. The person drawing water from a public fountain in Rome in 200 CE was standing in a city built and maintained by enslaved human beings. That is part of the floor. It belongs in the measurement. By the late 2nd century, the first cracks were showing. The Antonine Plague arrived from the east in 165 CE and killed perhaps 5 million people across the empire over 15 years. A second pandemic, when the Plague of Cyprian followed in 249 CE and ran for 20 years more. Between them, they took the empire's population from its peak of around 70 to 75 million and drove it downward. Military pressure on the Rhine and Danube frontiers was intensifying at the same time. The currency was being debased, harvests were under strain, the system was expensive to run, and it was being run on increasingly thin margins. Diocletian split the empire's administration in 285 CEE, and Constantine formalized that division. The East, wealthier, more urbanized, more defensible, anchored at Constantinople, would hold for another 1,000 years. The West was a different problem. The western provinces were further from the grain surplus of Egypt, more exposed on their northern and western frontiers, and more dependent on a military machine whose costs were rising faster than the tax base could support. In 350 CE, you could still stand in Londinium, or Lyon, or Carthage, and live inside a recognizably Roman city. Water came through pipes, bread was sold in markets, coins changed hands, courts operated, the roads were maintained. None of this was guaranteed. All of it rested on the continued functioning of a supply chain that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean and land. Within 50 years, large parts of it would be gone. The measure that will matter for everything that follows is not philosophical or cultural. It is these: people alive, food grown, words written, goods moving. These are human metrics. They do not belong to Rome. They belong to anyone who has ever needed to eat or drink clean water or know that a contract would be honored. When we ask what the Dark Ages were, this is the baseline we are asking about. The Western Empire did not fall on a single day, and it did not fall quietly. It came apart over roughly 2 centuries, province by province, city by city, street by street. The process was slow enough that almost no one living through it could see the whole shape of it. But the shape is visible now, and it is not subtle. Rome itself tells the story most starkly. At its height, the city held somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people. By 600 CE, the population was around 20,000. The forums were empty. The great bath complexes had gone cold. Cattle grazed on the Palatine Hill. The city that had administered an empire stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia was quieter than a modern market town. London had been a city of at least 30,000 people and probably closer to 60,000 at its peak, the largest city north of the Alps outside Rome itself. By the early 5th century, the public buildings had fallen into disrepair and the port had gone quiet. Within a generation of the last Roman administrator leaving in 410 CE, Londinium was effectively abandoned. And the Saxons who arrived later did not settle inside its walls. They built their own settlement to the west and left the Roman city alone, referring to it as a place built by giants. What the ground shows where Londinium stood is a thick layer of dark, featureless earth, gray, silty, structureless, blanketing the Roman levels across large parts of the city. It contains no buildings, no hearths, no occupation evidence. It is the soil of a place where people stopped living. So archaeologists call it dark earth, and it is one of the most eloquent silences in European history. The same silence appears in the pollen record. Across northern and western Europe, cores taken from lake sediments and bogs show the same pattern. cereal pollen falling sharply in the 5th and 6th centuries, replaced by tree pollen, oak, birch, alder, hazel, as forest crept back over abandoned fields. Farmland that had been cleared and worked for generations was going back to woodland. Forest does not reclaim farmed land unless the farmers are gone. In the Black Forest region of southern Germany, fields that Roman farmers had cleared and worked for generations went back to forest and stayed there for centuries. The land did not rest because anyone chose to let it rest. It rested because there were no longer enough people to work it. The trade network collapsed with the cities that had sustained it. The Mediterranean had been a Roman lake, a single managed system of ports, shrouds, and seasonal sailings that moved grain, oil, wine, pottery, metal, and glass across thousands of kilometers on a reliable annual schedule. By the 6th century, that system had fragmented into small regional circuits. A farmer in post-Roman Gaul ate what his immediate landscape could provide. The global supply chain was gone. Literacy followed. In Roman Britain, written Latin had been the language of administration, law, commerce, and increasingly of private life. Within a century of the Roman withdrawal, functional literacy outside the church had essentially disappeared across most of the island. No contracts, no accounts, no records, not because people had forgotten how to read, but because the institutions that had required reading had ceased to exist. The same collapse happened across much of Gaul, Hispania, and the Rhineland. The people were shorter than their grandparents had been. A man or woman grown to adulthood in post-Roman Gaul or Britain in the 5th century was, on average, smaller and less healthy than an adult born in the same region 2 centuries earlier. They had lived through harder winters, thinner harvests, and longer stretches without the kind of reliable food supply that lets a body develop fully. The decline was not dramatic in any single generation. Across several generations, it was unmistakable. None of this was universal or uniform. The Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, was largely untouched by the Western collapse. In parts of the Mediterranean South, in North Africa, in Syria, in Egypt, urban life continued with less interruption than in Britain or the Rhineland. The collapse was specifically and decisively a Western European phenomenon, concentrated in the provinces furthest from the empire's surviving eastern core, and none of it was permanent in every place or at every moment. Some British towns show continued occupation into the 5th century. Some Gaulish aristocrats maintained Roman villas and Roman literacy for generations after the formal end of imperial administration. Collapse is not total erasure. It is a population dropping, a system failing, a standard of living falling, unevenly, locally, over time, until the floor that held everything up is gone. The question the physical record raises, and which the revisionist videos do not answer, is not whether beautiful things were still being made. They were. The question is, what happened to the people who were not kings, and not monks, and not goldsmiths? What happened to the farmer whose market town had closed, whose road was no longer maintained, whose nearest physician was a day's walk away and probably not trained? That is the question the ground is answering. In the spring of 536 CE, the sun stopped behaving like the sun. Across the Mediterranean world and into Asia, the sky turned a dull, milky gray. Daylight came without warmth, shadows disappeared at noon. Crops that needed heat to ripen sat cold in the ground. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave its light without brightness, and looked, for 18 months, like a sun in eclipse. People at the time had no framework for what was happening. A cleric in Syria described the sun as dim and feeble. A Roman statesman named Cassiodorus wrote to a subordinate to explain why the seasons had gone wrong, why the moon looked blue, why summer had turned cold. He found no explanation that satisfied him. He was describing the aftermath of a volcanic eruption so large it had thrown a veil of ash and aerosol across the entire northern hemisphere. The eruption was almost certainly in the high northern latitudes. Iceland is the strongest candidate, though the precise volcano has not been confirmed. What is certain is the scale of what it did to the atmosphere. The veil it threw up was denser than anything the medieval world had experienced, denser than the eruption of Tambora in 1815 that caused the famous year without a summer. And it did not clear quickly. Summer temperatures across Europe dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius. That does not sound like much. For a subsistence farming population living close to the margins of what the land could produce, 2.5 degrees was the difference between a harvest and a famine. In Ireland, bread shortages persisted from 536 to 539. In China, the Tang Dynasty annals recorded great cold and famine the same year. Snow fell in summer. The cold reached across the known world. Then, in 539 or 540, a second eruption hit, almost certainly tropical in origin, possibly from the Ilopango caldera in what is now El Salvador. It was larger than the first. It pushed more aerosols into the stratosphere than Tambora would manage 12 centuries later. The recovery that had barely begun was canceled. Europe entered what would become the coldest decade in 2,000 years. A third eruption followed in 547. By this point, the atmosphere had been destabilized 3 times in 11 years. Summers were shortened, growing seasons contracted. Across Scandinavia, estimates suggest that populations may have fallen by as much as half during this period, and the Norse later remembered it as Vimble Winter, the great winter before the end of the world. They were not inventing mythology from nothing. They were remembering a real catastrophe. Into this world, already weakened, already hungry, already reduced in its capacity to absorb a new shock, came the plague. It appeared in the Egyptian port of Pelusium in 541 CE. Yes, it was bubonic plague, the same disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis that would return as the Black Death 8 centuries later. It moved through the trading networks of the Mediterranean with devastating speed, reaching Constantinople by 542, Gaul and Britain not long after. Constantinople was then the largest and most connected city in the Western world, which made it the worst possible place for the disease to land. The city had perhaps 500,000 inhabitants. At the height of the outbreak, it was reportedly killing 5,000 people a day. The Emperor Justinian himself contracted the disease and survived. Many of his subjects did not. The plague was not a single event. It came in waves, recurring outbreaks rolling through the Mediterranean world for the next 2 centuries, hitting weakened populations before they had fully recovered, arriving in 8 to 12-year cycles until around 750 CE. And the total death toll is genuinely uncertain, and historians still debate it, but estimates range from 25 to perhaps 50 million dead across the full 2-century span of recurrences. In individual outbreaks, some cities probably lost between 1/4 and 1/3 of their people. The sequencing of these events matters. The volcanic winters came first, contracting the agricultural base and reducing the caloric surplus that populations needed to resist disease. The plague then moved through a world that was already under metabolic stress. People who were hungrier, more crowded, less healthy, and less able to mount the immune response that might have saved them. A well-fed population behind intact city walls with a functioning grain supply does not die at the same rate as one that has already spent a decade eating badly. Justinian understood, at least partially, what was happening to his empire. He had spent his reign attempting to reunite the old Roman world, reconquering North Africa, reconquering Italy, pushing back against the Persians in the east. By 554 CE, he had largely succeeded. Within 14 years of his death, the Lombards had taken northern Italy back and the empire he had rebuilt was contracting again. The plague had consumed the tax base, the army, and the population that his ambitions required. This is the moment, 536 to roughly 600 CE, that sits at the center of the question the hook opened. The revisionist videos point to the art, the manuscripts, the metalwork, the great mosques. They are right that these things are extraordinary. But they were made after this. They were made by people living in the aftermath of the worst climatic event in 2,000 years, followed immediately by the first recorded plague pandemic in human history. The art is not evidence that nothing went wrong. It is evidence of what human beings do when everything has. The people who moved into the western provinces after Rome's withdrawal did not think of themselves as living through a dark age. They were not mourning a lost civilization. They were building something new kingdoms, new hierarchies, new forms of art and identity, in a landscape that Rome had made and then abandoned. To understand what they built, and you have to stop looking for Rome in it. The Visigoths had been inside the Roman world for generations before the Western Empire formally ended. They had served in Roman armies, adopted Roman law in modified forms, converted to Christianity, and traded in Roman markets. When they established their kingdom across southern Gaul and Iberia in the 5th century, they were not invaders from outside civilization. They were people who had grown up on its edges and were now occupying its center. And in Spain, the Visigothic kingdom lasted 200 years and left behind churches that are still standing. The Horseshoe Arch, which would later define the great mosques of Córdoba and Seville, was a Visigothic invention. Their gold votive crowns, hung above altars in churches across Iberia, were worked with a precision that Roman goldsmiths would have recognized as their own tradition carried forward. These were not imitations of Roman art. They were the next thing that came after it. The Ostrogoths in Italy were led by Theodorus, who had grown up as a hostage in the court of Constantinople and been educated as a Roman. He spoke Greek, understood Roman administration, and governed Italy from Ravenna for over 30 years with a sophistication that impressed even his enemies. The mosaics he commissioned in the basilicas of Ravenna rank among the finest produced anywhere in the 6th century world. He was also an Arian Christian in a Catholic country, which made him permanently suspect in the eyes of Rome, and which the Byzantine Emperor Justinian would use as justification for erasing him from history after his death. Theodorus died in 526 CE and was buried in a mausoleum outside Ravenna, whose roof is a single piece of Istrian limestone weighing 300 tons, floated across the Adriatic on a raft and lowered into place. There is nothing else like it in early medieval Europe. It looks like nothing that came before it and nothing that came after. It is the tomb of a man who had absorbed two civilizations and made something entirely his own from both. The Franks were different from the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths in one important respect. They had converted to Catholic Christianity rather than Arianism, which meant they had the Pope on their side. That alliance was the foundation of Carolingian power. When Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome on Christmas Day 800 CE, he was not claiming to restore the Roman Empire. He was claiming something new, a Christian empire of the north, with its own logic, its own capital at Aachen, and its own God-given mandate. The Carolingian Renaissance was a real thing. Charlemagne gathered scholars from across Europe, from England, from Ireland, from Italy, to his court at Aachen, and set them to work copying manuscripts, standardizing Latin, each reforming the liturgy, and rebuilding the educational institutions that the post-Roman collapse had destroyed. More ancient texts survive today because of Carolingian copying programs than from any other single cause. The monasteries that preserved classical knowledge did not do so passively. They did so because Charlemagne made it a project. But the Carolingian Empire was built on violence as well as scholarship. The Saxon Wars ran for 32 years, from 772 to 804 CE. And Charlemagne's armies moved through Saxony, destroying pagan shrines, burning sacred groves, and forcing baptism at sword point. In 785, he issued a law making it a capital offense to refuse baptism or to practice pagan rituals. In 782, after a Saxon rebellion, he ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners at Verdun in a single day. The Carolingian Renaissance and the massacre of Verdun are not separate stories. They are the same story. In East Anglia, around 625 CE, a king was buried in a ship hauled up from the River Deben and covered with an earthen mound 30 meters across. His burial chamber was filled with gold shoulder clasps inlaid with garnets from Sri Lanka, a ceremonial helmet of Swedish design, silver bowls from Constantinople, and a purse of Frankish gold coins. It is one of the most extraordinary concentrations of wealth and craft skill ever found in Northern Europe. And it was buried in a country where urban life had effectively ceased, and literacy outside the church had nearly disappeared. The Sutton Hoo treasure is not proof that nothing went wrong. It is proof that the people at the top of a post-Roman society could still command extraordinary resources and extraordinary skill. The king who was buried there controlled trade routes, tribute networks, and craftsmen of exceptional ability. The people who worked his fields, who were not buried in ships and whose names are not remembered, lived in a world without markets, without coins, without clean water piped to a public fountain, and without a physician within a day's walk. Both of those worlds were real, and both of them matter. What the barbarian kingdoms built was not a lesser version of Rome. It was something structurally different, smaller in scale, more local in its horizons, more violent in its methods of social control, even more dependent on the personal loyalty of warriors than on the impersonal machinery of law and administration. In some ways, it was more honest. The power that Roman law had dressed in the language of justice was now expressed openly in gold and iron at a king's belt. The art reflected that world with complete fidelity. It is magnificent precisely because it does not pretend to be something it is not. Islam was born in the Arabian Peninsula in the early 7th century. Within a decade of its founding, Arab armies had taken Syria, Persia, and Egypt. Within a century, the Islamic world stretched from the Atlantic coast of Iberia to the borders of India, the fastest territorial expansion in recorded history. The speed of it has always demanded an explanation, and part of that explanation is the one the revisionist videos never give. The Byzantine and Sassanid empires that stood in its path had just spent 90 years being dismantled by plague. When the Arab armies moved into Syria and Egypt in the 600s and 640s, they were not fighting the empires at full strength. They were fighting the remnants of two powers that had lost enormous fractions of their populations, their tax bases, and their armies to recurrent waves of the Justinianic plague. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius had fought the Persians to exhaustion between 602 and 628 CE. By the time the Arab conquest arrived, both empires were hollowed out. Weakened powers cannot hold borders, and these borders did not hold. Islam moved into a world restructured by catastrophe and built something new inside the space that catastrophe had made. That is not a diminishment of what it built. It is the context without which what it built cannot be understood. The Dome of the Rock, the great mosques, the translation movement, the flowering of astronomy and mathematics and medicine, all of these came out of a civilization that had inherited the ruins of two older ones and had the confidence, the resources, and the intellectual ambition to transform them into something entirely its own. The Dome of the Rock was completed in 691 CE on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, on the site where the Second Jewish Temple had stood before the Romans destroyed it in 70 CE. The Caliph Abd al-Malik built it during a period of internal political crisis, and he built it with complete deliberateness. Its octagonal form borrowed from Byzantine church architecture. Its mosaics were made by craftsmen trained in the Byzantine tradition. Its inscription running around the interior dome addressed the Christians directly in their own theological language and told them that God had no son. This was not a building that had emerged from the desert, but it was a building in explicit conversation with everything that had come before it. And it was more beautiful than most of what it was arguing with. Inside, the light moves across the mosaics in a way that changes through the day. Gold and green, vines and jeweled crowns. The decoration of a paradise made visible in stone and glass. The geometry of the building is precise to a degree that was wholly intentional. The height of the dome, the diameter of its base, and the length of each face of the octagon are all equal. Every proportion carries meaning. Standing inside it in the 7th century, you were standing inside an argument made in mathematics and mosaic that Islam had arrived, that it had its own visual language, and that the language was extraordinary. The Great Mosque at Damascus followed in 715 CE, built by the Umayyad Caliph al-Walid I on the site of a Christian cathedral that had itself been built on the site of a Roman temple to Jupiter. The mosaics inside depicted cities, rivers, and trees, visions of paradise rendered in gold and green on a scale that filled entire walls. A man walking through those mosaics in the 8th century was walking through a vision of the afterlife made tangible. That was the point. Islam understood from very early on that architecture was theology. The translation movement began seriously under the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in the 8th and 9th centuries, and it was one of the most consequential intellectual projects in human history. Greek philosophical and scientific texts, Aristotle, Ptolemy, Galen, Euclid, were translated into Arabic by teams of scholars, many of them Christian and Jewish, working under state patronage. What happened next is the part the revisionist videos tend to get wrong. Islamic scholars did not merely preserve these texts, they extended them, corrected them, argued with them, and built new knowledge on top of them. The algebra of al-Khwarizmi, the astronomical observations of al-Battani, the medical encyclopedia of Ibn Sina. These were not archives, they were advances. By the 10th century, the city of Córdoba in southern Spain was the largest city in Western Europe. Its population was somewhere around 300,000 to 500,000, a figure contemporary London or Paris could not have approached. It had paved streets, street lighting, a functioning sewer system, and public baths. The Caliph al-Hakam II maintained a library of 400,000 volumes. He founded 27 free schools in the city. A female scholar named Lubna served as the principal librarian and was herself a mathematician of note. This was not an anomaly. This was the ordinary level of civilization in a city at the height of Islamic Iberia. Christians and Jews lived and worked inside this world. The Jewish communities in Al-Andalus reached a level of cultural and intellectual flourishing under Umayyad rule that they had not known under the Visigoths and would not know again for centuries after the Christian reconquest. The physician and diplomat Hasdai ibn Shaprut served in the court of Abd al-Rahman III and used his position to make Córdoba a center of Hebrew scholarship. When toleration in Umayyad Spain was not unconditional, it came with legal restrictions and tax obligations, but it was real, and its results were visible in the city streets. The Islamic world was not a single unified entity, and it is important not to treat it as one. The Umayyads and the Abbasids were rival dynasties. The Caliphate in Córdoba and the Caliphate in Baghdad existed in explicit competition. Internal wars, dynastic crises, and sectarian divisions ran through this world as they run through all worlds of comparable scale. The Umayyad Caliphate in Spain collapsed into civil war in the early 11th century and never recovered. The point is not that Islamic civilization was perfect. The point is that at its height, in these centuries, it was doing things that nowhere else in the world could match, and it was doing them in a landscape the plague had emptied and restructured. Yet what Islamic civilization built in the Dark Ages was not built in spite of the catastrophe. It was built because the catastrophe had created the conditions, the power vacuum, the available territory, the inherited ruins of two older civilizations, into which a new and confident civilization could expand. The Dome of the Rock sits on the ruins of the Second Temple. The great Mosque of Cordoba was built on the foundations of a Visigothic church. This was a civilization that knew how to use what it found, and it found a great deal. Ireland had never been part of the Roman Empire. Its roads were tracks, its cities were hill forts, its writing was the runic scratches of the Ogham alphabet. When the Western Empire collapsed and the continental monasteries began to struggle, Ireland was insulated from the worst of it, not because it was wealthy or powerful, but because there was nothing there for the post-Roman chaos to dismantle. And the catastrophe that had hollowed out Gaul and Britain had not reached the far western edge of the world, and the monks on that edge understood, with remarkable clarity, what that meant. They went to work. From the 5th century onward, Irish monasteries became the most active copying operations in the Western world. Their primary purpose was religious, the preservation and transmission of scripture, liturgy, and theological commentary. But they did not stop there. Virgil's Aeneid, Cicero's orations, Plato's dialogues, the works of the Latin grammarians, all of it was copied onto vellum by monks who understood that a text not copied was a text that would eventually cease to exist. The vellum was expensive, and the labor was immense. A single gospel book required the skins of roughly 150 calves. A monk copying a large text worked for months or years on a single volume, in poor light, in cold rooms, with instruments he had made himself. And it was understood as a form of devotion. Every letter of Scripture copied was a prayer. But the practical consequence of that devotion was the survival of knowledge that would otherwise have vanished with the last literate generation of the continental Roman world. Irish missionaries carried this knowledge back out into a devastated Europe. Columbanus left Ireland in 590 CE with 12 companions and walked to Gaul, then into what is now Switzerland and Italy, founding monasteries as he went. Columba had already crossed to Scotland and established the monastery at Iona in 563 CE, which would become the mother house of Lindisfarne. These were not gentle pastoral journeys. They were expeditions into a broken continent, and the monks who undertook them knew it. Lindisfarne sits a mile off the Northumbrian coast, separated from the mainland by a tidal causeway that disappears for several hours each day. The monk Aidan chose it in 635 CE, precisely for that separation. The mainland was dangerous, politically unstable, religiously divided, and within reach of the violence that had already reshaped Britain twice in 2 centuries. The island was defensible, quiet, and had fresh water. It was, in the terms available to Aidan, a reasonable place to build something that might last. What was built there, within 2 generations of Aidan's arrival, was the Lindisfarne Gospels. The monk Edfrith began work on them around 715 CE, probably alone, and worked on them for the rest of his life. He died before they were finished. The book runs to 516 pages of vellum. Edfrith mixed 90 colors himself from 6 local minerals and vegetable extracts. He used a lead stylus to rough out his designs on the reverse of each page, invented a light box to transfer patterns through the vellum, and worked at a level of intricate detail that required, by any modern estimate, extraordinary eyesight and extraordinary patience. The carpet pages, the great decorative pages that open each gospel, are not decoration in any casual sense. They are interlaced geometric constructions of such complexity that scholars using modern computing tools have spent years analyzing their underlying grids. Each one is built on a precise mathematical framework of dots and lines, pricked through the vellum with a stylus before a single brushstroke was laid down. The complexity is not accidental, and it is not ornamental. It is a statement that the Word of God deserves the most difficult and precise thing a human hand can produce. The visual language Eadfrith used was new. Mediterranean Christian iconography, the evangelist portraits, the gospel scenes, sat alongside Celtic interlacing and Anglo-Saxon metalwork patterns and Germanic animal forms. No one had put these traditions together in this way before. The Lindisfarne Gospels were not a copy of anything. They were a synthesis made possible only by the specific collision of cultures that had occurred in 7th century Northumbria. Irish missionaries, Anglo-Saxon patrons, Roman ecclesiastical structure, and a visual tradition reaching back through the British Isles to a pre-Roman past. What the monasteries saved was real and important and should not be minimized, but what they could not save was larger. Roughly a third of all Latin literature survived the post-Roman centuries, and of ancient Greek literature, the figure is closer to 10%. The oral traditions of the pre-Christian North, the songs, the legal codes, the genealogies, the cosmologies of peoples who had never developed a written culture, disappeared almost entirely. Languages died with their last speakers and left no record. The monasteries were an emergency operation, and like all emergency operations, they saved what they could reach and let the rest go. Yet the monks themselves did not experience their work as an emergency. Eadfrith, sitting over his vellum on Holy Island in the early 8th century, was not a man in crisis. He was a man in full possession of his purpose, working with the best materials he could obtain on a project he believed would honor God and outlast his own life. He was right on both counts. The Lindisfarne Gospels are in the British Library in London, intact, still legible, still extraordinary. 1,300 years after the hand that made them went still. That is not the output of a dark age. It is the output of a man who refused to accept the darkness, working at the edge of a continent that had largely gone quiet, making something that would carry the word forward whether or not anyone was listening. The term Dark Ages was invented by a 14th century Italian poet named Petrarch, who had never visited Britain, had no access to tree-ring data, and whose primary interest was in flattering the wealthy Florentine patrons who paid for his work. He looked back at the 1,000 years between Rome and his own day and called them darkness, not because he had studied what happened to ordinary people, but because he had decided that anything that was not classical Rome was not worth his attention. It was an act of intellectual vanity dressed up as historical judgment, and it stuck for 600 years. The revisionist historians who pushed back against Petrarch were right to do so. The period he dismissed produced the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Dome of the Rock, the Great Mosque at Cordoba, the Sutton Hoo treasure, the Silver Bible of the Goths, and Theodoric's Mausoleum in Ravenna. It produced Islamic algebra and Arabic astronomy and the Carolingian manuscripts that preserved most of what we know about the classical world. Calling that darkness is absurd, and the revisionist response was a necessary correction. But the revisionist thesis overcorrected. It pointed at the art, and the art is extraordinary, and then quietly stopped asking the question the art cannot answer. What was it like to be alive in post-Roman Western Europe if you were not a king, not a bishop, and not a goldsmith? The Sutton Hoo treasure is magnificent. It was made by skilled hands for a powerful man, also in a country where the nearest Roman-era city had been abandoned for 2 centuries. The art and the deprivation existed at the same time, in the same place, among the same people. Petrarch created the first myth because it served his agenda. The revisionist debunking became the second myth because it served a different one. The modern instinct to correct Eurocentric narratives, to rehabilitate peoples who had been unfairly maligned, to push back against the condescension of an older historiography that could not see beauty outside the Roman tradition. These are good instincts. They produced good work. And they produced a story that is just as incomplete as the one it replaced. What the evidence actually shows is this. The Western Roman world contracted catastrophically between roughly 400 and 600 CE. Cities emptied. Trade stopped. Fields went back to forest. People grew shorter and died younger. And the volcanic winters of 536 and 540 and 547 shortened the growing seasons across the northern hemisphere. The Justinianic plague moved through a weakened population in waves for 2 centuries and killed tens of millions. These events were not a story. They were conditions, the physical conditions of daily life for the majority of people living through these centuries in Western Europe. Out of those conditions, 3 distinct civilizational responses emerged. In the West, the barbarian kingdoms built new political structures and new artistic traditions in the ruins of the Roman provinces, with violence and creativity in roughly equal measure. In the South, the Islamic world expanded into the demographic vacuum the plague had made and built. In architecture, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, the most sophisticated civilization on the planet. In the North, the monasteries chose the most difficult possible locations and the most labor-intensive possible methods to carry the written word across the silence. None of these responses was trying to restore Rome. All of them were building something new. The people who lived through the worst of it. The farmers of post-Roman Gaul eating from a contracting landscape. The inhabitants of Constantinople watching the plague take 5,000 of their neighbors in a single day. The monks on Lindisfarne, hearing in 793 that the Vikings had come, did not experience their lives as either dark or enlightened. They experienced them as lives. The categories belong to us, not to them. What belongs to them is the work they left behind, made under conditions we would not choose, out of materials that were running short, for reasons they understood better than we do. The real story of the Dark Ages is not a story about whether things were good or bad. It is a story about what human beings do when the system that sustained them stops working. They grieve and they adapt and they build. Sometimes they build badly with cruelty and waste and loss. Sometimes they build with a beauty that outlasts everything else. Usually they do both at once, in the same generation, in the same kingdom, with the same hands. The Lindisfarne Gospels and the massacre of Verdun are not different stories. They are one story, and it is the only honest version of these centuries that the evidence will support.